Hello, and welcome to Functional Evaluation for Coalitions Using Data Strategically. This webinar will help you assess whether you are getting the most out of your data. With 51 participants, this webinar originally aired on April 6th and April 13th, 2016. This recording is for those of you who could not attend on those dates, as well as those of you who would like a review of the material. So let's get started. First, a little bit about the webinar series and who I am. My name, as I said, is Dr. Bill Geary. I am the founder of Global Evaluation Solutions, and I have been involved in evaluation work for about 18 years. I started out in project evaluation, program evaluation, and eventually started working in community and coalition level evaluation as well. I'm also a two-time coordinator for two different coalitions. One was an inner city coalition, the other is suburban communities that care coalition. And I am recently, I was the deputy director of evaluation and research at CADCA's National Coalition Institute. The purpose of this webinar series is to give coalitions a little more power around their evaluation and help them make decisions that benefit them. And so one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves as coalition folks is, who is it that's driving our evaluation? What is it that's driving our evaluation? I find that oftentimes coalition evaluation is being driven by a funder. And that is to say, the funder decides what's the kind of data that should be collected. They decide when that data should be collected, and they even make decisions for coalitions in terms of how the data should be reported. Certainly, they make decisions on how it should be reported to them. And to some extent, coalitions are allowed under this kind of model to do their own evaluation, but they certainly have to work around or with or sometimes through the parameters that are laid out by the funder. I think that often coalitions look for models, look for information, coalitions who want to do their own evaluation. So they may hire an outside evaluator, for example, or they may turn to national-based resources such as organizations who are involved in coalition work, or even websites that talk about evaluation work. And I think that's the same thing may happen here that happens with funders, that the needs of the coalition sometimes are not met. And part of that is because a lot of folks have opinions about what kind of coalition or what kind of evaluation coalitions should engage in. I refer to that as the do it my way approach. And the do it my way approach is basically, filling out forms, what we could refer to as a franchising of evaluation. We have to do it a certain way. And I don't know that that way necessarily aligns with what coalitions need, particularly for organizations or evaluators who don't really have their finger on the pulse of a particular organization or coalition. So if they've not sat down and talked to you and asked you about your needs, it's a little hard for them, I think, to figure out what they should do. Not to say that they don't have skills to bring to the table, but it is to say that sometimes important decisions about evaluation are not made by the coalition when they're relying on these types of resources. The other thing that can happen is these types of resources can get confusing, which is to say, if you're not involved in evaluation regularly, or you've not done a lot of community evaluation or coalition evaluation work, sometimes it's hard to know where to start, but it's also hard to keep up with the learning curve. There's a pretty high learning curve that can occur, and sometimes coalitions get overwhelmed with the amount of information that's available and not being able to understand, does this information apply to me? So this webinar series hopefully is a way of creating conversations in coalitions that allow them to be more strategic and think more deeply about their evaluation, even if that means just increasing the level of conversation that an evaluation, that a coalition can have with their evaluator. So based on all that then, we know that one of the most important things about an evaluation is that it has some utility. That is to say that it serves some function. And the question is, what function should it serve? And what we're going to offer today is that a functional evaluation uses data strategically to align with the goals of the organization. So then part of that process is being able to figure out what's the data that we're currently collecting, and then aligning that data, each piece of data, with a specific goal or maybe even multiple goals of the organization. That way we can identify which pieces of data we're getting the most out of as an organization and which pieces of data maybe we're not getting a lot out of. And what that allows us to do is be more strategic about the kinds of resources that we want to use as an organization on each type of data. Some benefits of this approach, of course, is that it allows us to identify our most valuable data. What's the data that we're getting the most out of in terms of achieving our goals? Helps us ensure that we're collecting the data that we truly need so that we're not collecting data that we're quite frankly not using. I find that sometimes, especially if you use outside evaluators who are not very close to the coalition, they're used to collecting certain kinds of data because that's a template that they have in place. For any particular coalition, however, that data may or may not be helpful for them. Uh, Always allows for flexibility in data collection. That's another thing I have found. Typically, coalitions will collect the same kinds of data for many, many, many years without revisiting and wondering, is this meeting our goals? Have our goals changed over the past year or so? And do we need to make adjustments then to the kind of data that we're looking for or that we're collecting? From all this, then, it's the ability to use our data as efficiently as possible. Again, we don't want to be spending resources on data that we're not getting a lot out of. And it ensures that we're not wasting valuable resources on data that doesn't fit into our goals. So we're going to talk a little bit about data then, if we're trying to align data to goals, and we're going to talk a little bit about goals. What are the kinds of data that coalitions typically collect? Well, we find that coalitions typically collect two broad categories of data, and we're going to talk about each of these. One broad category of data is data about the coalition, right? This is organizational data that tells us, how is the coalition functioning? How are you doing? And so there are two general subcategories within coalition data that we might be interested in. For example, coalitions will collect data on their capacity. And capacity has many different definitions. The definition that we're using here is one that's a pretty familiar one that's consistent through a lot of the literature, and that is the ability or power to engage in collective action in order to impact outcomes. In other words, are you doing what you say you want to do? Organizations that are able to successfully do that over a period of time, we can say have high capacity. Typically, then, capacity can come from examining three different elements. One of those would be the roles of partners and the role that the coalition plays in the community. Does everybody know their role? Meetings are another important part of coalition work. Obviously, there's a lot of decision making that occurs. Obviously, coalitions meet often, maybe every month, maybe more than that. So we want to make sure that our meetings are effective use of people's time, and we want to make sure that people feel comfortable going to the meetings and that they feel that that they're engaged in meetings, that they feel that the meetings are important. And it's important for them to be there, right? We find high levels of dissatisfaction and an eventual destruction of the infrastructure of a coalition if people do not think that the meetings are worthwhile. Then they'll stop coming. We also want to look at partnerships under capacity, how not just the number of partnerships that we have, but how we're utilizing them. How deeply involved are they in the processes that we're engaged with? Recent research that I'd been involved in tells us, in fact, that if you're going to do different kinds of strategies, different kinds of partnerships are required. Not that different partners are required, which can be true, but the level of interaction. So are you involved in strategies that require a lot of partners who don't do a lot, or are you involved in strategies that require just 2 or 3 partners that do a lot of work on that strategy? Depending on the kind of strategy you're trying to implement, you should give some thought to that. So these 3 elements, roles, meetings, and partnerships, all impact a coalition's capacity, and that's one of the subcategories. The other subcategory under coalitions would be outputs. When we talk about outputs, we think about the types and amounts of collective actions, that means something that the organization does, that actually has an impact on the outcomes, which we'll talk about in a minute, community level outcomes, which we'll talk about in a minute. Generally, there are 3 categories of outputs that coalitions track or keep track of. The purpose here for collecting outputs is to show that what you're doing as an organization has had some type of impact in the community. And the way that we can measure that is we could measure the amount of resources that have been made available in the community around substance abuse prevention. So if your coalition gets a grant, for example, of $50,000, then you could say, hey, we have data that shows that now there's $50,000 allocated to substance abuse prevention that wasn't allocated before. The coalition played a direct role in bringing those resources in. But there might be other kinds of resources that you bring to the table as well as a coalition, and that could include new partnerships that didn't exist before, or it could include material resources that you're bringing in, computers, things like that. Another important output might be media, that is to say communication. How is the coalition or the community communicating about these various issues? So how many conversations was the coalition involved at a community level around substance abuse prevention? Did you offer town hall meetings, for example? Were there letters to the editor? Did you use Facebook posts that you had a certain number of people who viewed? Was there signage in the community around certain issues that people saw? Anything that impacts the flow of information in a community around substance abuse prevention, we can measure, and we can say that we had some type of an impact based on those measurements. And then the last is changes in policies or practices. Based on the work of the coalition, are there now policies in place that were not in place before? Which isn't to say that the coalition was the only group that may have led to those policies, but identifying what role the coalition plays in any change in practice or policy. Practice might be something relating to, for example, police patrols. Right? Police patrols are usually mandated. Usually officers know where they're supposed to be on their patrol, and maybe we're going to shift those patrols around because there's something going on that we need something looked at. That's a change in practice. So those types of formal and informal policies and procedures. So those are the 2 types of coalition data that we collect, right? It's data around capacity, how well is the organization functioning, and it's data around outputs. What's the impact of the work the coalition does on the community? Which takes us to our second category of data that coalitions will typically collect. And we refer to these as community data, right? This is data not about the coalition, but about the community that they serve. One type of data that is often collected is consequence data. This is a really important piece of data because the primary purpose of most coalitions is to make the community a better place to live. And better place to live is defined often in terms of consequences. What are the consequences in our community around substance abuse? Are we having some type of impact, making people's lives better around these issues? So some of the issues that might be involved with substance abuse prevention, I put some of those on the slide. For example, illness. right? We know that communities that have very high rates of substance abuse have more illness, both for youth and adults. Missed days at work, missed days at school, lower performance at work or school. That's just one example of a consequence of substance abuse in a community. Another might be just physical health. Are there certain types of illnesses that we have in our community that we can say are significantly impacted by substance abuse, right? We know that substance abuse, depending on the kind of substance, leads to all kinds of, or is associated with all kinds of disease and unhealthy states in our community, right? So we know it's heart disease, liver disease. There are certain types of cancers, depending on the types of substances that are being abused. So we want to know what's the impact in our community around those things, right? Are we a healthy community or not? And then the last is what I refer to as kind of emergency or crisis issues. And I've talked to a lot of coalition folks who, understanding this, they'll collect things like emergency room data, right? How many emergency room visits are attributable to substance abuse. There are other kinds. There are some coalitions who collect data on crime rates around certain drug houses, for example. That certainly is a negative consequence of substance abuse in a community. Some communities suffer from fire issues. If you have abandoned buildings where there's um, crack houses, whatever, right? And so people get sloppy with fire, or if you're in a community where folks are making meth, explosions, right? These types of crisis issues can all be attributed to substance abuse issues in some way. So consequences are the primary target for most coalitions. These are the things that we want to improve when we are engaged in prevention work. The other type is the type usually that funders spend the most time asking for, and that's rates, distributions of community behavior, risk factors, local conditions that drive those risk factors. This is the kind of data that most coalitions hang their hat on to show that they're making a difference or not, right? Rates and distributions of 30-day use of marijuana or alcohol go down. Therefore, we must be doing a good job, right? So coalitions are typically very familiar with these kinds of things. Risk factors, probably one of the most important one. There's a graphic on this slide about that, right? And that is distribution, right, of alcohol. How much is available? Availability of alcohol in the community or any other type of substance. We know that availability is one of the primary indicators of use or abuse. Risk factors also might involve things like who is providing for youth. You could have local conditions, for example, that parents are providing at parties. That there's lots of coalitions who are dealing or trying to manage the issue that parents are actually sharing alcohol with their high school or even middle school youth, right? Where they're hosting parties and telling the kids it's okay to drink as long as you don't try to drive afterwards, right? So these are types of local conditions that would explain how youth are drinking. Are they drinking alone, at parties, in groups, at the park? Where are they doing it? These are all the local condition outcomes that we typically track. And coalitions typically will gauge their success or failure based on this. Now, part of this conversation is that while this data is important, obviously, to have, there needs to be some thought about, if you're collecting this data, are you making the most out of it? Are there other goals that you could be satisfying besides just satisfying this funder's requirements, right? What are the goals that you could be using this data for? So what we want to do is we want to be able to list all the data we're currently collecting. This webinar is not about you need to go collect more data. It's about these are the general categories of data that coalitions collect. Are you getting the most out of that? Do you know which goals are being aligned with that? Which takes us to the next step of this. After we list all of our data, just simply go in and write down we're collecting data. We'll walk through a worksheet in a few minutes. The next step is to identify the goals after we've identified our data. So again, for those of you who know me, I never do anything off the cuff. I always look for some type of research on these types of issues. And the research identifies, in general, 8 functions for evaluation. That is to say that when we ask people, why do you do evaluation? What do you use your evaluation for? There are 8 general categories that do or can overlap, right? These are not clearly defined categories. It's important to keep that in mind. There will be overlap. You'll see as we go through this. The thought process here, though, is being able to clarify what are the important goals of our coalition, and how does one goal compare to another goal in terms of the amount of resources or the importance that we attribute to it, the amount of resources we want to use on that goal. So let's take each of these very quickly. If you're listening to this, you probably will associate what you're doing in your coalition with some of these goals as we go through, although they may not have been well articulated up to this point. Of course, one of the primary concerns of all coalitions, or any organization even, is the budgetary issue, right? How are resources being allocated between the different programs, partners, projects? This is particularly true for coalitions that are involved in universal strategies, right? Because you're not running programs typically, you're overseeing a variety of programs and a variety of strategies in a community. So it's important to be able to track what kinds of resources you're using to keep those strategies going, so that if adjustments need to be made in terms of resource allocation, you can make them. Another important function for evaluation is folks say, hey, we use our evaluation to determine what we should be celebrating as a coalition. We know that celebration is an important piece of keeping folks happy. Typically, this type of work takes couple years before we really start seeing a difference in what we do. So celebration becomes an important piece of making sure that people don't become too frustrated about what they are doing. So we look for points of celebration, right? Which accomplishments should we be celebrating is one of the things that evaluation can help you with. And evaluation can also help you make decisions about how you should celebrate, because not all celebrations are equal, and not all data worth celebrating is worth celebrating in the same way. There may be different audiences, for example, that you want to include in the celebration, depending on what are the resources we want to spend on celebration and how we do that. So part of this then is making sure that you are using data to celebrate, and a lot of coalitions do in fact do that. I would stress that typically the coalitions that I've been familiar with will only or primarily use that community outcome data for celebration. But there are other types of data, as we've talked about, that could be used for celebration as well. Another important element, certainly around sustainability, certainly around organizational capacity, is what we'll refer to as motivation. Right? The idea that we want to keep stakeholders, partners vested in what we are doing. We want to keep them interested in our work, so that when we do need them to come to the table and help, they will come to the table and help. So one of the things that we can use evaluation for is to motivate our partners to work with us, or maybe to work more deeply with us, provide us resources, things like that. Another important reason for evaluation is promotion. Promotion refers to the idea that we want to demonstrate to partners that the coalition is doing a good job, right? That we are succeeding in the things we try to succeed in, and that we are successful. We certainly know that one of the primary recruiting tools to bring people on board is showing that you have success, right? And this speaks to not just the idea of promotion, but also speaks to the idea of how promotion can be related to motivation, right? That they can be related. but they are distinct, right? Motivation primarily refers to making sure people are interested in our work and are coming to the table, versus promotion, which is the idea that we're using data to positively reflect on what the coalition is doing. And that may or may not involve partners. Sometimes the general community will use data for promotion around that as well. Another function for evaluation, and something else you can be using your data for, is to maintain control over the coalition. I laugh a little bit there because I once heard someone say that running a coalition is like herding cats. But when we say control, what we mean by that, what the research means by that, I should say, is making sure that the coalition is in compliance with rules, regulations that it may have from funders, for example, or also making sure that we are doing what we're supposed to be doing with our partners, right? If you have partnerships, you should have some type of signed document in terms of what the role of the partner is, the role of the coalition is, and we want to make sure that we're maintaining that. We want to be able to show people that we do what we say we're going to do, even in terms of providing partners at the table, providing them with materials, with other things that we promised that we would provide them with, and that they are doing the same for us. So one of the things that we could be using evaluation for is to demonstrate that we are in fact doing the things that we said we were going to do, usually by signed agreement, that we are upholding our end and that other folks are upholding their end of those relationships. Hopefully, folks that are already doing evaluation are learning from what they do, and that's what this next one refers to is evaluation allows us to uncover to some degree what's working and what's not working. And I say to some degree because depending on the level of evaluation you have, that is easier, or maybe not so easy depending on what you're doing. But the point is we want to be able to figure out what parts of our strategies are effective, which ones aren't. And this is why it's so important to have a clearly defined strategy in place, and an assessment or an evaluation of each piece of that strategy so that we know if there's going to be a breakdown somewhere in the strategy. We know where that is and we know how to fix that. We don't want to wait till data comes out 2 years later to find out that a strategy is not working, right? We need our short-term and our intermediate-term goals based on the strategy that we're engaged in, so we know what piece of the puzzle isn't working right? But we also want to know what's working because there may be things that we can apply from one area that's working and put that into another strategy somewhere else if we know that is effective. The next piece is what I define as appraisal, right? And appraisal is just basically a general 30,000 foot view. How's the coalition doing, right? How are we doing in general? If we look at all the pieces that we're trying to manage and we look at all the evaluation data that we're collecting, can we make an assessment about our ability to do what it is that we need to do? And that includes everything. That's not just hitting the numbers that we want to hit, right? That includes things like partnerships that are developing, the ability to communicate with partners and with the community. We want to look at all of that and get an overall scorecard. What's the overall performance of the evaluation? And again, you can see there's very easy overlap between this and other areas, but coalitions have stated and will use evaluation for the purpose of getting a broad picture. I think it's pretty easy to see how you could have an evaluation that just focuses on specific pieces of what you're doing, but doesn't talk about the overall health, for example, of the effort. And so we want to be able to use evaluation for that as well. Along with that, we want to be able to improve what we do. That doesn't just mean that we want to be more effective. It could mean that we want to be more effective, but maybe one of the things that it means is we want to be more efficient. Just like this conversation is not about, are you collecting the right data? And that's not the only question we're asking. We're asking the question, for the data that you're collecting, are you getting the most out of that data? In other words, are you collecting data and using it efficiently? And so this idea of improvement, right? How can we do things better? How can we be more effective as an organization? Is identified as another primary category for why we do evaluation. And certainly that's not to say that these 8 are the only 8 functions that evaluation may have. You may want to have a conversation with your coalition about the other types of goals or strategies that you're involved with. What is it that the coalition wants to accomplish? Do they fall within those parameters? So before we get to the exercise, I just want to quickly recap what we have covered so far. And what we uncovered so far is, first, we talked about functional evaluation. That is the utility of an evaluation, using data strategically to align with your goals. We then talked a little bit about the different categories of data, including coalition data and community data that coalitions typically collect and are responsible for. We then talked about the research and the 8 functions or goals for evaluation and what it is that coalitions want to use their evaluation for. So what are some next steps then as we move forward? Well, as I identified earlier, first we want to start making sure that we're doing this. So we want to be able to prioritize our goals, which is to say we want to have a conversation about what are the goals of the coalition. I have a worksheet that lists these 8 on them. I'm happy to share that with anyone. I have my contact information at the end of this. These worksheets were made available during the original webinar, but it allows for a conversation and making sure that the coalition agrees not just on what the goals are, but the importance of goals. Because certainly I think it's very easy to imagine that, yes, we want to be able to do all 8 of these things, like these are all 8, but which ones are more important? Remembering that this may change over time. So we do have a worksheet with that. Now, having said that, it's important to think about in advance, who do you want involved in this exercise or in this conversation? Some coalitions would be comfortable having everyone on the coalition who's a regular member of the coalition sitting around a big table and engaging in an exercise where they talk about the prioritization of goals. Others, maybe not so much. There might be examples of coalitions who only have maybe there's some type of subcommittee, or maybe there's some type of board that controls the coalition. And so they're going to think about what they think the goals are and then maybe share that with the rest of the group to see if there's agreement about that. So we want to think not only about who should be involved in the conversation and who should be filling out these worksheets, but we want to think about how we're going to be doing that as well. No matter what we do require a prioritization of those goals. And as I said earlier, we will also need a list of the data, which should be pretty easy to get. And we will talk about that in just a second. So the data alignment sheet then looks like this. And as you can see, what you would do on the left column that says data, that's where you list the data. And then you can provide a check mark for every goal that you think can be aligned with that particular piece of data. So we're thinking then, once we look at this worksheet, we have a group within the coalition or the entire coalition who will have a discussion and reach some level of agreement about, hey, what's the data we need to be collecting more of, maybe, because it's, we're getting a lot out of this kind of data. Is there other kinds of data related to that? Or do we have data that only has like one thing checked on the box? And maybe that one thing is a low priority goal for us. And maybe it's taking us a lot of resources to collect that. Maybe we need to reconsider if we should be collecting that data or not. The point of all of that is we should be having a conversation at some point with the coalition about the alignment of our data to the goals. Now, one of the things that's good about this conversation is sometimes I find, as an evaluator, with 15 years of coalition evaluation experience under my belt, it's really easy, especially if you use an outside evaluator, it's really easy for coalition members to not even know what data is being collected. They may have a general sense of it. I mean, everybody knows that you do a school survey or whatever, but are there other types of data that's being collected? And having somebody just sit down and write them all down familiarizes or sometimes refamiliarizes important folks on the coalition or the entire coalition about how much data are we actually collecting, right? Are we collecting data that is not very useful? So it allows for that conversation. The other conversation, of course, that it allows for is just making sure that everyone is in agreement on the prioritization of the goals. Should we be striving for this as a goal this year? Is this something that we're struggling with, that we need to spend more time working on? These are the kinds of conversations I'm hoping that coalitions will have about the data in order to use that data more efficiently. And so that wraps up functional evaluation for coalitions. There are a couple final points that I wanted to make regarding future webinars and regarding a PowerPoint that's on YouTube that will walk people through the exercise as opposed to just going through all this information. So let's start with the webinar series. By popular demand, because I asked the folks who were involved in the first webinar, as I said, there were a little 51, I think, folks. And no doubt, probably the most important topic that people brought up that they want to hear more about is how do you get a good evaluation or how do you get a good evaluator, right? And I think that those two things are interconnected. I think you can't find a good evaluator unless you know what they're supposed to do in advance. So on May 4th, I'll be doing a webinar on coalition evaluation standards, and we're going to introduce the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Standards for Educational Evaluation. This is one of the standards, for example, that the CDC uses as a guide for how evaluation should be done, and we're going to frame it in terms of, well, this refers to program evaluation. We're going to frame this in terms of coalition evaluation. What are these standards? How do you know if you have a good evaluation or not? Simply put, people don't know what they don't know. So this is my attempt to help raise the bar on the level of conversation that coalitions will have amongst themselves, but also with evaluators, and say, hey, we have this information about the standards. How do you intend to meet this standard, right? I think it's important to have that conversation. June 8th, then, we're going to talk about finding the best evaluator for your coalition. There are all kinds of folks with all kinds of skills out there. So we want to make sure that when you're looking for someone to help you with evaluation, and that may be a full-time evaluator, or it may be somebody who just offers assistance once in a while when you have questions, we want to make sure that that's the right person and that meets the need, that they're meeting the needs that you have because you're spending resources on that. And then the final webinar that's scheduled right now is July 13th, Similarities and Differences Between Program and Community Evaluation. This is a topic that's often visited in terms of verses. Like, what's the difference? But there's a lot of similarity, obviously. Evaluation is evaluation. And on May 4th, we're going to talk about the standards of evaluation, whether that be program evaluation or community evaluation. Those standards apply. So we're going to talk from a skills-based perspective. What are some of the skills that you need to engage the standards? But then what's the learning curve for different kinds of evaluation? Are there some skill sets that are more practical or useful at the program level versus doing community evaluation? Right, and so what are some of the differences? For example, concepts like reliability and validity, very basic concepts in evaluation, very basic concepts in research, but can have different meaning whether you're doing a program evaluation or a community evaluation. So we're going to talk about that on July 13th. So we have May 4th talking about the standards. June 8th, we're going to talk about how you find a evaluator for your coalition. July 13th, similarities and differences between program and community evaluation. If you have any questions, comments, if you need templates, again, Dr. Bill Geary, you can reach me at either of these two emails, help@coalitionevaluation.com, who's one of the proud sponsors of this webinar series, or wgeary@globalevaluationsolutions.com. And now the last thing that I wanted to cover is accompanying this webinar, which is basically the content. There is a webinar series referred to as Training in Practice Tip for Coalitions. I've placed the link to the YouTube channel here. And basically it's a series of 5 to 6 minute videos that whoever is involved in the exercise can watch in advance, or you can sit in the same room and watch it, and specifically walks you through the exercise in terms of what's the background information you need to know to engage in this exercise, why are you doing this exercise, how do you do the exercise, and now what do you do that you've done this exercise. So it's broken down into those components. So thank you very much for listening. If you, again, have any questions, comments, templates, want to get a hold of me, this is where I am. Please feel free. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much.